Hey friends, thank you all for tuning in to Heritage Day 2020 with our special theme, Rebuilding a Shattered Economy. And our next speaker, Patrick Kuwana, is going to talk specifically on rebuilding the economy on a new foundation. I had the privilege to be introduced to Patrick a while back, and we found that we had a lot of things in common. He's also the founder and CEO of C3 Capital, a private investment business that uniquely combines financial capital with a business growth, acceleration blueprint, and strategic execution expertise to create inclusive wealth and prosperity out of investment opportunities, mostly in Africa. Now, he's also a prolific speaker in high demand in various circles, and you will find out why in just a few seconds. So I think, Patrick, with that, I want to hand over to you.
Yes, but thank you so much. It is really such a privilege and an honor, especially on a Heritage Day like this, to be able to be on a platform and just connect with people who are committed to doing amazing things in our country, in our continent, and I think across the world. So it's really just an honor to be part of this. I think before I get into the actual slides, maybe let me just start off by giving a little bit of a background to some of the things that I'm going to share with you. And this really comes out of, I think, in life, we occasionally have these moments where everything sort of turns around and you start thinking about things very differently. And I think for me, it was in 2010, really being in a position where I really started looking in a lot more intentionality around Africa as a continent, but also looking at the tremendous opportunity and also tremendous potential that lies within the African continent. And for me, looking at all of those things, but also realizing the reality of where we were as a continent that's been blessed with such an abundance of resource, and yet we continue to be the begging bowl of the world. We somehow have failed to convert this vast abundance that we actually have within us into a mechanism or an ecosystem that can really create wealth, inclusive wealth for the entire world, and especially for Africans as well. So I think that's really where the journey sort of started for me, and that journey involved a lot of searching, a lot of trying to find answers to the why we were in the position we were in, but also what were some of those solutions that we need to think about going forward. So I'll share a bit of that as we go along, and also hopefully share a little bit of some of the practical things that we've seen, that we are involved in, hopefully as a way to further encourage us that Africa is indeed a continent of so much opportunity. And I believe we're going to see a lot of that opportunity, come to fruition as we sort of go forward from where we are now. So let's talk about rebuilding our economy on a different foundation. I think, whenever with the title that Jasper and his team came up with, rebuilding our shattered economy, it immediately begs the question, one then has to be asking the question, where exactly is the economy at the moment? And why are we seeing some of the things that we are seeing globally? COVID has induced a whole new outlook into the economics situation. We've got the rise of, social injustice movements across the world. There are also, I believe, just lights that are shining into a system that was already on a trajectory of collapsing and beginning to literally go on its knees and needs to be resuscitated. So for me, looking back at, there's this gentleman, Milton Friedman. He was an American economist, and in 1970, he came up with what is known as the Friedman Doctrine, which has been largely the foundation of the form of capitalism that we see in the world today. And he made some statements which have really become the foundation of most economies from a capitalist perspective. And in his doctrine, he talked about the fact that the social responsibility for any business is purely to increase its profits, and that a company did not have any social responsibility to the public or to society, that all it needed to focus on was to maximize short-term profits for its shareholders, for its owners, regardless of what the social or environmental cost would be. And that's largely what we have seen in the global economy. But what that has done, it's brought about a form of economic behavior that is largely exploitative, and one that has resulted in an unsustainable inequality in the economy. And whenever there is unsustainable inequality in any economy, and once exploitation gets to a particular threshold, typically the economy will have to self-correct in some way, and that self-correction could even come via an uprising of people, Arab Spring type of scenario. But there's always a breaking point where an economy that has become so exploitative, but also so unequal, it eventually self-corrects, and that self-correction can either be done intentionally by the people in the economy, or it will come through other forces, and that's typically the direction that we never want to go. So let's look at this a little bit more in terms of, so what are some of these things that have led to the instability that we actually have today? It's things like the maximization of short-term profits for a few, often at the expense of the sustainable people, planet aspects of the entire economy. We have somehow developed this mindset that for one person to win, it means that somebody else has to lose. And we've lost the consciousness of how do we both win in our economic activity, rather than exploiting another to win the game. Interesting enough, we've had so much fear-based economics. There's so much debt in the system, and it's all about gaining market share, because everybody wants a political influence as they gain market share. One of the other presenters earlier on this morning talked about this. We're shifting leadership. We've had this top-down authoritarian chain of command, this autocratic leadership, even within economies, where businesses grow so big that we have monopolies that begin to influence even the rules of the game economically for their own purposes of greed. And that's what creates this exploitation and this unequal foundation. Things like predatory behavior, the growth of large corporations which are controlled by a few. Interesting enough, one of the controversial points that I make is we have such a rise in the value of non-productive jobs. Whereas, traders, where money is being created out of nothing at the expense of real productivity, which is your factory workers, your miners, the people who are actually doing the value-adding work. And sadly enough, those who provide essential services like nurses and teachers are even further down the value chain. it's a completely upside down system, because the very foundation of what we need is what the system values the least. And again, that adds to the crumbling of the system. And I think what COVID has also done, especially within your healthcare, it's exposed the healthcare system in terms of just how lesser valued people in that sector have been, but meanwhile, they are a critical foundational component that needs to be recognized for the value that they're bringing into any economy. Unfortunately, whenever you have a situation where a few control the resources, it means that often billions of people are kept and controlled in a position of poverty. And sadly, even some governments thrive on the fact that they purposely keep people in poverty and will occasionally throw out the breadcrumb of philanthropy or aid to try and help them. So that's the scenario that we have been in. And I believe, for me, what's been interesting in my journey is just looking at economics from a very simplistic perspective. Because before, I used to hear all these complicated phrases and I used to get all confused, and I used to think, oh my goodness, what's my role in this? And how do we potentially even begin to shift economies if I actually don't even understand what it really means, because of often the very complicated jargon that is used. So for me, the word economy actually comes out of the Greek word oikonomia, which basically means management of the household. And an economy, at the end of the day, is the management of the household, which means every single person who is in the household has to benefit from that economy. So my own family, that's a household. We have our own little economy that's going on in my household. I stay in Johannesburg. Johannesburg is part of the bigger household. There's an economy that's taking place in Johannesburg. It goes all the way up to South Africa as a nation. It goes all the way up to Africa. But every single person who sits in the African continent is part of the African household, and therefore is part of the African economy. Likewise for South Africa. So what's typically happening in an economy? Very basically, what we are talking about is, it's about production. We have to produce, we add value, we create value through products and services. And as we create that value, we then need to distribute that product or service. We need to get it to where it needs to be consumed, because there's consumption taking place. And lastly, there is trade that's also taking place. We're exchanging that value, often through a medium of exchange, which the primary one today is money. So that's essentially what is happening in any economy. The people in the household are producing, adding value, and as they produce, what they produce is then distributed to where it's needed, and then it's also consumed. And by the way, the idea is to produce more than you consume, so that the excess can then be traded with other people outside your household. And then that's how we add the value. That's how we begin to build wealth within the household. So production is critical, but your production must always be greater than your consumption, so that you're constantly building that value. I believe we desperately need a just and righteous economic vision. Because once we understand that we are all in the household together, South Africa, black, white, whatever tribe we are from, whatever language we speak, we are essentially all part of the household. And the most critical objective economically from any household is the well-being, the prosperity, and the wealth of that household. And that should be our aspiration as any people who are in a household, so that the whole house can prosper. And that's really the output that we want to get out of the economy. So in basic terms, number one, we have assets, we have national resources, we put capital money into this, but the most critical asset that we have as a household is our people, because we need to have our people fully engaged in production. Because when our people and all our resources and our capital are fully utilized in production, we are able then to increase the value of what we are producing so that we can then distribute, consume, and also export so that we can gain even more profitability and more income into the household. Government also plays a role. We need the right government legislation, the right fiscal policy, the right monetary policy, the right trade policies to be in place, the right labor laws to be in place so that it encourages and creates a conducive environment for this production process to take place. One of the things I lament about South Africa is we cannot, it's impossible for us to reach our full potential if a huge part of our population is on social grants and are not contributing towards the production process. It's difficult for us to grow and reach the potential that we should be reaching if government does not do something drastic about point number 5, which is the illicit output, which is the corruption that's taking place. Because all corruption does, it robs the system out of the resources it needs to be able for this multiplication process to take place. And critically on the output, as I said earlier, the output should be focused on the well-being and the prosperity of everyone in the household, and also should be reinvested back into the assets so that the production process can be increased. So that's basically, very simplistically, the economy. For me, the main point with the slide is to say we need to have a clear economic vision. What are we trying to achieve? Because if we're trying to achieve the prosperity and the well-being of everyone in the household, it then changes the policies and how we treat this whole system in terms of how we practically work it out. So one of the things that is important is whatever you use in your foundation will determine the quality of your building. So when we're looking at the foundation of an economy, I believe there are a number of critical pillars that we have to consider very strongly. We have to value every human being, because this is about the household, and therefore every single person in the household has value. And by the way, if somebody is sitting begging by the street corner, it means somewhere along the line the household has failed them, and that's why they have lost their position in being a value-adding resource to the household. And therefore we need to relook ourselves and ask ourselves the question, what has the household done that has actually ostracized that person who's begging on the street? And what should we be doing as the other people in the household to figure out how we bring them back? And therefore, it's a household mentality. How do we bring and empower people to be productive in the household? So it's the value of every human being. There has to be righteousness and justice. And what I mean by that is we have to always view the household in how do we do what is right and how do we do what is just for people in the household. And by the way, if we fail at doing that, we have to be truthful about our failure. And if somebody fails, we also need to have enough mercy and loving kindness to reintegrate them back into the household so that they can resume being productive in the household. And therefore, this is a foundation that becomes very critical when we look at how we begin to rebuild the economy on a very different foundation. Today, I'm not going to debate economic systems. We could debate capitalism, we could debate socialism, we could debate all of these things, but all I'm going to say is that there are critical things that will determine whether economy will be prosperous or not. What will lead to economic decline and this very situation where we've got so much inequality and so much exploitation is a system that's built upon greed, selfishness, and pride, that rewards laziness and corruption and punishes hard work and honesty, will always lead to a downward spiral of the economy, whether it's socialist, whether it's communist, whether it's capitalism. But as long as there's greed, selfishness, and pride, and a rewarding of laziness and corruption, and a punishing of hard work and honesty, it will always lead to a decline. A system where people are controlled and manipulated, dominated, and oppressed will always lead to decline. So whatever system we are building, it has to be based on the principles, the three pillars of generosity, servanthood, and humility. It has to reward hard work and honesty, and it has to punish laziness and corruption. That's why this issue of corruption in South Africa is a big thing. Corruption has to be punished, and at the same time, laziness has to be punished. And what I mean by punishing laziness is we cannot reward people or give them incentives for being lazy. We have to figure out a way where we shift people who can work to a position where we equip them, we empower them, so that in whatever level they can enter into the system again and begin to be productive and to assist the system in growing. It has to be an empowerment and nurturing. It has to be one that's based on service, so that people operate in a perspective of freedom, but they know that what they put into the system, they will get out, and that there's no exploitation in the system. Let me share 5 quick things that we can start to think about that are part of this reconstructing of this foundation. Firstly, we have to restore the hierarchy of value. And that's what I've been talking about already. We have to understand that people are more valuable than money, and that relationships are more valuable than transactions. Now, this goes completely opposite to the Friedman theory, which has driven capitalism for the last 50 years, where it's all been about the shareholder and exploit people, exploit the environment, extract as much as you can, as long as you walk away with what you want. So we have to restore the hierarchy of value. Secondly, we have to reverse the cycle of human hatred. And what I mean by that is, because we have not done point number 1 well, we've exploited people for money, we have created broken, wounded relationships, whether it's across racial lines, whether it's across gender lines, whether it's across business sectors, whether it's within ourselves. We need to reverse the cycle of human hatred by bringing about reconciling relationships in a way that values the contribution that people can bring to the table, even if they currently are not bringing that contribution to the table because the system has been broken. Thirdly, we have to reverse cycles of economic injustice and unrighteousness. We have to remove all forms of human exploitation in the pursuit of economic and financial gain. Again, it speaks into point number 1, the hierarchy of value. Number 4, we have to make a plan for the excluded, the poor, the helpless, to enter into the system again. There's some who, the elderly, the widows, the orphans, those who can't be productive, we have to look after them. But at the same time, those who can be productive, we have to be thinking about how do we, as the household, embrace them and bring them back into productive activity in the household, whether it's through retraining them, whether it's through reconciling relationships that are broken so that we can re-equip them with the dignity of participation in the system. Fifthly, we have to have the right regulatory policy and a governance system that will reward hard work and honesty, and that will punish laziness and corruption. And this is where, you know, all the things that are happening at a governmental level, we need to have the right policy structures to enable this, so that the household can begin to operate within the right framework. So these are just 5 things that we can begin to think about in terms of how we are looking at the foundations of the economy. I believe we also need to reconstruct our economic mindset, because for us to be able to do this, it requires a major shift in mindset. Because again, as I speak to different groups, a lot of what we have considered to be the best economic theory and the best business school practices for the last 50 years have unfortunately been built upon the very Friedman theory that I started with. And therefore we've become extremely competent at being successful at exploitative economics. And therefore we carry our MBAs, we carry, you know, all our degrees, but often a lot of the wisdom that we are carrying has been built upon the wrong foundation of exploitative economics that focuses solely on making short-term profits for the shareholder and the owners, and not on the flourishing of the household. And therefore we need to think through where our mindset is and whether we need to shift our mind from perhaps even things that we've been taught all our lives. How do we focus on the love of people as being more important than the love of money? Relationships being more important than transactions? How do we see ourselves as stewards within the household rather than selfish owners, because we want to steward the resources, the assets that are in the household, so that everyone else prospers even as we are prospering? We have to think about multiplication rather than division, because you see, division is about how do I take away from you so that I can do something, whereas multiplication is how do we actually combine what we have and create something new that we didn't have before. It's about releasing of abundance rather than hoarding of scarcity. Because often when we think scarcity, we actually self-fulfill the prophecy, because we end up bringing scarcity into play because we are hoarding all the resources, and instead of those resources, the finance, the capital being in the system, being used to multiply the system, we end up hoarding, and we actually create the very scarcity that we are worried about. And often we see that so often in some of the projects that we get involved in. It's about prospering others so that we can prosper self. And it's about how do we co-create value and wealth rather than how do we extract value and wealth. These are some of the things that we need to really be thinking about. There's an ancient proverb that talks about, as a man thinketh, so is he. And I've added a little bit of it to myself to then say, and so he'll produce, and so his future will be. We really have to be very careful what our mindset is within our activities economically. You see, the most critical thing that we need to be focusing on is how do we maximize access for all so that we maximize prosperity for all. Because the more people in the household who are productive, the more people in the household who are honestly productive and hardworking, the more the goods and the services that the household is producing increases, so that the household begins to grow in wealth at a sustainable level, where the inequalities and the exploitation is no longer an issue. It shoots up levels of productivity, it shoots up levels of self-worth, identity, etc., which all are part of being productive. And most of you will know, for any economic system, any business to flow, it's about confidence and trust. And that's why, we hear about the business confidence index, we hear about, business trust. Wherever there's confidence and trust, transactions will take place a lot smoother. And what we really want to do is create a household where there's enough confidence and trust amongst the members in the household, so that that trust and that confidence is what fuels the household to keep growing and keep multiplying. As I said, that household could be your own family unit, that household could be your business, that household could be your community, the Four Ways community group. It could be the entire farming industry. It could be the entire nation of South Africa. It could be the entire continent of Africa. But it's a household, and how do we flourish within that household? Again, there's an ancient proverb that talks about unequal and dishonest scales are an abomination. And often what happens when you find dishonest and unequal scales, it literally leads into an economic decline over time because it's unsustainable. So we need to be able to be in a position where, how do we get access to markets for everyone? Financial capital, infrastructure, assets, resources. A critical component is, how do we educate the household? How do we give good health care to the household, so that out of that we are creating employment and work for the household? Because the economy is about the prosperity and the well-being of the household, if we start to build the recipe from the bottom upwards, where we consider our success based on the measurement of how we uplift the very poor of the poor and the very helpless of the helpless, if we use that as the measure and the target of what we are trying to do, what interestingly happens is we start to produce a fire that goes all the way from the bottom to the top. Because you see, when you start to pay attention to the bottom, or the marginalized, or those who have not been participating in the household, and you find a way of bringing them in, you literally create the strongest possible foundation that will drive the growth upwards in the whole economy. But at the same time, you completely neutralize the aspect of governmental manipulation, the manipulation of the poor who are typically looking to government as being their savior. And I always say to other business people, guys, it's not government's responsibility to look after the poor and those who are helpless. It's actually our responsibility as business people, because we are the ones who should be shaping how the economy is built. And we need to build looking at the helpless in terms of how we put it together. I want to share perhaps just some thoughts and just some practical things. Again, Africa as a continent, so well endowed with resources, probably more so than any other continent in the world. Interesting enough, so well endowed with people. We have the youngest population in the world. I think, if I remember correctly, the more than half of the African continent is less than 25 years old. So we have two of the greatest assets that are required in any economy, that is natural resources and people. But you see, what the world has enjoyed about Africa is that we have given them our resources as a raw commodity supplier at whatever price they choose to give us. And likewise, they have sold us finished goods at whatever price they choose to sell it us. And therefore, they love us because we are such a great consumer market. They take the raw materials, they value add them, they sell them back to us at the price that they set, and we buy it, and they love us because we are a great 1.3 billion consumer market. But I believe as Africa, we need to start changing this. But this also comes with a change in mindset. We need to take over that value creation aspect of the economic cycle. And this is why production becomes so important. So I cringe when I read some of the economic reports and articles that give Africa raving reports, because they are typically looking at the potential of Africa as a consumer. But I believe as Africa, we now need to step into our role as a value adder in the global economic cycle. We have the resources, we have the people. Perhaps what we've lacked is the leadership and the mindset to be able to take the difficult road of starting to reconstruct our position in the global economy. Because I believe if we take up the role of extracting our resources for local value add, empowering our people for local value creation, and beginning to trade with the world according to our strength of the abundance that we carry. And I think this is where the African Free Trade Agreement, hopefully with governmental and political will, can get us to that place where we begin to do that. As an investment company looking at Africa, one of the key things that we are constantly very mindful of is that we have such a wealth of what I call genesis resources, and that's the natural resources of Africa, whether it's farming, the land, it's mining, it's energy, oil, gas, water. We have such an abundance of natural God-given resources. And our inheritance as a continent is based on how we steward these genesis resources and not give these resources away in a way that leads to the exploitation of our own resources. And therefore, as we look to the economic ecosystem of Africa, we get excited about working with businesses that are seeing the potential of the genesis resources, but how do we add value to those genesis resources? Because once we are able to do that, we can then begin to increase our value in the value chain, the distribution, the logistics, the retail, the trade, and eventually the higher level services, financial services, etc., but also bringing in innovation, education technology, bringing in a smart agricultural technology, bringing in health tech, fintech, giving people access to, but again, all built within an ecosystem that is looking at what we call these genesis resources. Because if we do that, I truly believe, and the team that I'm working with truly believe, we can start to shift our position in the global economic sphere as Africa. But it all comes from, are we seeing ourselves as South Africa as being a household? Are we seeing ourselves as Africa as being a household? And are we prepared to bring the reconciliation that breaks the racial boundaries, that breaks the South Africa-Nigeria boundaries, so that we can begin to get economies of scale in terms of what we are doing? Just one other point I want to throw into the mix, because when I look at Africa, because of the amount of resources we have, I ask myself the question, do we really understand the potential that we can have in the global economic space because of the abundance of asset-based resources that we have? And that brings me again to the genesis resources. Because a lot of what's happened over the last 50 years is 50 years ago, essentially the US dollar was decoupled from the asset of gold, which basically means before that, before President Nixon cut the US dollar off gold, it basically meant for every dollar there had to be a corresponding gold bar somewhere that actually backed up the value of that dollar. But in 1971, all of that was done away. So money is essentially now paper. There's no real value attached to it other than the promise of a government to say that this money is worth something. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is it's interesting that next year we enter into the 50th anniversary since this decoupling happened completely. And I just wonder that, are we getting to the point where the economic system is so burdened with valueless money that perhaps it's time for people to start thinking about what is real value? Are we building a debt-based economy, or are we building an asset-based economy? Because you see, in my very immature understanding of economics, something in me says I would rather have an asset-based economy than a debt-based economy, just purely from understanding childhood money. Even understanding what happens in my family, I would rather have an economy that's asset-based rather than debt-based. So I leave that for further discussion in your own environments. The other thing that I just throw out there in line with that is, again, are we perhaps seeing a shift in the mediums of trade? Fiat money that doesn't have real value attached to it. There's gold, there's silver, there's precious stones. We see the rise of cryptocurrencies, etc. Again, I'm not a financial expert to be able to give financial advice, but all I'm saying is I think these are things that we should be thinking about very, very intently and discerning perhaps what is potentially happening across the economy. As I finish off, what I want to do is I want to quickly bring it to some practical things within your business, etc. One of the things that we've worked with for many years is building this platform that we call the relational economics of relational mutual value co-creation. And all this is, it's a way of thinking that we've literally just said, okay, everything starts with people. People are the most valuable thing. We have to create mutual value. It can't be exploitative value. We have to be cognizant of the external environment, and we build our businesses based on a 5-pillar basis of what's our vision, what's our strategy, leadership is a critical component, culture and people. And if we build a platform of business health that's focused on mutual value creation, that's also taking into consideration all the external environments, our business model is built upon that. We look at the market from that perspective, we produce results, but ultimately it's a system that is allowing everyone to flourish. So whenever we are looking to work with businesses, collaborate with businesses, this is one of the things that we immediately bring to the table, because even in our activities, we immediately want to be bringing in a different mindset and a different operational model to how we participate within the economy. Because the more people do that, the more we can shift the economy, I believe, to the place where we want the economy to be. Education is a big element of this. And I think we need to be educating our people with the right things, because an education certificate is not what we are aspiring for. It's about how do we educate people with practical skills that will enable them to participate. And I think that's what it's really all about. And if every person is of value in the household, how do we make sure we equip people in the household accordingly? How do we relook healthcare from a very different perspective? Because you see, if people are the most valuable asset, then I want my people to live healthily and for as long as possible, because the longer they live and the more healthy they are, the more that they contribute towards this value creation process. So I'm just mentioning these things because even at a governmental level, I challenge government to say, what's the purpose of our education system? Is it just to give people certificates? What's the purpose of healthcare? Is healthcare a strategic element into ensuring that our people live long and live healthy and are educated with the right skills so that they can be part of the production process to increase the value that's in the household? Let's not give government power that they don't have. Let's not be waiting for government to do something. We as business people should do this ourselves. We don't need government to tell us how to reconstruct the agricultural industry. We don't need government to tell us how to reconstruct the food processing industry. We can do that ourselves. We are already working with a lot of farmers across South Africa. New farming models, new models of bringing in emerging farmers together with commercial farmers. We are already working with establishing different value chains. We don't have to wait for government to come up with some unjust and some unjust land reform program. Let's not wait for government. Let's get this thing done. We have the capability to get it done ourselves. And I think so often we end up mesmerized and playing a puppet role where government pulls the strings in the economy, whereas we should be pulling the strings and government should be following based on the fact that we are already doing the things that need to be done and we don't need legislation to force us to do anything. We do the right thing, we do the just thing, we bring everyone in the household into economic productivity, and we prosper everyone in the household as we do that. So my call to action as I finish off now is how will you or your organization contribute towards maximizing access for all? We each have the ability and we each have the calling, I believe, to make a difference. Even if that difference is through my network, how can I give somebody access to my network who will be able to benefit because by having access to my network, they'll be able to get a resource or a connection that they need to be able to get themselves to the next level. How do we give people who don't have access to markets, access to markets? Financial capital. There are many people who are desperate for financial capital. We need to completely, almost like burst this capital market structure apart and release funds so that the funds can be working the system to multiply things. How do we give people access to assets, resources? How do we empower people who need education, who need good healthcare, so that our people in the household can prosper, can be looked after well, so that they can contribute towards the household, create employment, etc. So I think that's really it for my side for now. If you want to engage a little bit more, we've got a website that we call rebuildingtheeconomy.com. You can go to that website, you can register, you'll get a newsletter, and we've got different discussions, webinars that we run on there, taking some of these concepts that I've talked about and discussing them further. But also, even as Jasper and his network, I mean, this is part of us joining that network and really wanting to see how do we collaborate, how do we co-create, how do we bring the resources that we have in the household and begin to use those resources to multiply. But I think my parting word is, let's not wait for government. Please, let's not be held captive by government. Let's do these things ourselves. We can reform South Africa's agriculture. We can reform South Africa's manufacturing. We can change this economy without needing government to be a puppet master. So that's my last bit. Thank you so much for the time. It's been so good speaking to you. Thank you.
Oh, Patrick, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's some powerful thoughts and powerful ideas in there, and very practical, which I love. And I think, as you've mentioned, it ties in 100% with our philosophy, and hence this platform today, has been born out of, some simple business people taking some simple actions to make a difference, to make some changes, and then try to extend those networks. So, those words towards the end of your presentation, touched 100% for me on the exact, mindset and philosophies that we're trying to espouse and work on. And yeah, I see we've got a couple of questions. So Ellie's waving her hand desperately at me. So Ellie, I'm going to get you to unmute if I can just find you on the list here and let you have a quick question. We've got still sort of five or so minutes, so we can take a few. So Ellie, over to you.
Hi Patrick, really thought-provoking presentation, truly. I'm in the UK, and I totally get where you're coming from about it. Really hit hard for me when you were saying about the African, the sort of the resources being taken for what price people want and then sold back at a price that they want, and you can see the inequality there. That's hopefully that's something that does change. But do you also feel, when we're looking at change, change has to come from the top, change has to come from the middle, but change has to come from the bottom. And there's so many divisions in our societies, from cultures, whether it be towards diversity, such as myself, or towards religion or faith. Or we have so many ways that we sort of we put ourselves in little different boxes, and it seems really difficult for us all to come together with those boxes there. Have you got any thoughts in that area?
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments and for the question. I really believe that it's part of the mindset, and I really loved, I think, Michael Jackson, and I can't remember the other lady who presented secondly, who talked a bit about the mindset and where we are as individuals. And I think as individuals, we are often in the mindset of either self-preservation or what I call self-righteousness. And whenever we are caught up in self-preservation and self-righteousness, it literally becomes a stumbling block for us to be able to move beyond ourselves and begin to understand what is happening across the fence and how we can be a contributor towards empowering others who are also sitting with self-preservation and self-righteousness. So it almost needs people who are willing to step out and go beyond where they are to discover something new that perhaps they've never discovered before, because they've always held the view that what I know is truth. But often what we know is actually not truth at all. It's just my perception based on what I know, but there's so much else out there that I need to discover, and all of that is what begins to form truth. So I think we need to almost get out of what we believe to be true and rediscover by stepping outside our comfort zones.
Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, we had a speaker on one of our previous events who spoke about unlearning, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about, is actually unlearning those habits, unlearning those predefined perceptions of what we think is reality, what we think is truth, and actually learning what's really going on out there in the world. And so yeah, love that. There's a couple of other questions I want to just pick up quickly from the chat box. So Motolapule said, could ancient wisdom of doing business help against exploitative economics? I'm thinking of Ubuntu as a way of life as an example. Instead of bemoaning the absence of Ubuntu, how can we cultivate it in our circles, our families, our communities?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I thank you for that question. Again, you see, part of what we've just been talking about now is finding that, if I can almost call it, that middle ground where we take the thinking behind capitalism, which is very critical because it brings about the understanding that we have to invest to be able to get something out of anything. But we can't invest and exploit the system so that we are the only ones who get something out. Likewise, on the far end, we cannot be entitled to anything. We have to realize that we have to work for it, and we also have to invest to be able to get it. So just to answer that question, Ubuntu is absolutely a critical component of it. But at the same time, when I look at the origins of Ubuntu, when I look at my village, I'm originating from Zimbabwe, and I think back, way back when I was a kid, everyone understood that they would participate in that village economy. Everyone would help each other with the necessary inputs. If I didn't have the plow to plow the field, somebody else would lend me or give me the plow to plow the field. If I had the seed and somebody else didn't have seed, we would do that. But the concept was all based on we all have to work and be productive to get something out. Entitlement was non-existent. So for me, it's a question of, yes, there's ancient wisdom, even in our cultures, that we need to bring back the human element. But as we bring back the human element, it's a human element that says, how do we thrive together by being productive? But at the same time, how do we shun non-productivity, laziness, and people who don't contribute? And for me, that's what ancient African culture was even about. And many ancient cultures were built upon that very simple principle.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick, for that. Right. I think some of these others you answered in your presentation, during the presentation, but Donovan has asked, how do you motivate those in control to shift the focus from individual enrichment to community empowerment?
Yeah, I think on that one, first of all, my first comment is that we ourselves, where we are, we have to do it first. So let's walk this out, walk it out in your business, walk it out in your community, because I think the more we see pockets of success as we walk it out, the more the leaders or the people who are in positions of influence will begin to say, but hang on, I now need to pay attention to what's going on here because I can see that it's successful. So if I look at, one of the groups group of farmers in Pittsburgh, for example, that have brought all their farms into one big co-op, brought their workers into the co-op. They're now farming together. They're now doing all sorts of things together. Government has not been involved in any of that, but the production that's coming out of that, people who have moved themselves to do it, is starting to get the attention of government and other people because they can see the results. And I think what we need to do is, as much as we talk, we actually need to walk the talk, because when we walk the talk, that's when people will come on board.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more, Patrick. Absolutely superb. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your wisdom, your input today. It's been a real pleasure to host you on the session today. And we'd love to take it further and connect and keep this family going.